There are two ways to export a PDF from CLO. Under the simulation dropdown in print layout mode, here you can organize your patterns, nesting them within the fabric width. And with this button, you can export out a PDF at 1:1 scale, meaning real life scale. The problem is that this exports an image as opposed to vector lines that are editable. So instead, we'll do a file export Adobe PDF. And this relies on the organization of your 2D window. So I'm going to show you how to prepare the export. With Transform Pattern, I'm going to select and delete any identical symmetric copies. I don't need to print the same pattern twice because I'll just double my fabric when I cut. If you're using this as a 3D garment, make sure you save that file out separately before you do this because it will delete patterns from your 3D window. Even though my fronts are symmetric copies in CLO, I'm going to print them both so that I have my button and buttonhole placement. My collar and undercollar are slightly different, so I'm also going to print both of these. If yours are identical, you could delete one. Even though my backs are actually not symmetric copies in CLO because of my kick pleat, I'm actually going to delete one side and just keep one because the patterns themselves are identical for printing. Now that we've narrowed it down to only the patterns we need to print, the next step is to add seam allowance with the seam allowance tool here. I'll start by marqueing over all of my patterns and setting the default seam allowance that I want for most of my pattern edges. Mine's going to be 3/8 of an inch. Then you can select specific patterns or segments and change the amount. I'm going to marquee over my collar and undercollar and change these to 1/4 of an inch. Just make sure that anything you change, you also change what it sews to. So I'm also going to select my neckline and the part of my jacket that sews to my lapel and change those to 1/4 of an inch. I'll also change my back neckline and my lapel facing, though I've decided to leave this interior edge as 3/8 of an inch. You can use the seam allowance tool for larger turnback hems. There are these intersection options that change the angle of the seam allowance and how it's applied, but I felt like I didn't see anything that was an exact mirror of my pattern, so I've decided to do it differently for my sleeves. So I've set my seam allowance back to my standard 3/8 of an inch, and with my edit pattern tool, I'm going to select the bottom edge of my sleeve and right click and choose offset pattern outline. I'm going to add the amount I want to turn back. Check this box create internal line if you want a marking for that fold, and under the drop down menu, select mirror. I just need to add the seam allowance to the sides here, but just make sure that you remember the default matches 1 centimeter and it isn't exactly 3/8 of an inch. I did, however, use the seam allowance tool for my jacket hem, which is just a double turn back at 3/4 of an inch. When all your seam allowances are set, you're ready to arrange the patterns in the 2D window. I'm going to go back to my Transform Pattern tool, and under the information icon, I'm going to turn on my guides here. If you right click on the top of the guide, you can change the unit of measure, and I'm going to set mine to inches. My issue here is I work in inches in my patterns, and yet I live in Australia and our printer prints at A4. So just make sure whatever unit you're working in CLO, you're also using that unit of measure for printing. But instead, I'm just going to base my measurements off of letter size paper for the example here. If you zoom in 2D, you'll see that the rulers zoom in as well. To add a guide, you just drag from the ruler at the side or the top, just like in Adobe Illustrator. You want to think a bit about the breaks in the pages, so the width of the paper, and I've marked this out as though there's 4 sheets of paper, but I actually did the math wrong, thinking that letter was 8 inches wide. It's 8.5, so that's why I marked my ruler at 32 inches. So now I'm going to lay it out at that width, knowing that that's going to be 4 pieces of paper wide. So using Transform Pattern, you can select pieces. Here I'm going to hold Shift and select both of my fronts and right click on one of them to align them at the bottom. So any pieces that you want to line up perfectly, you can do this with. Then I'm going to use the sort of 0 axis, the floor, as my starting point, and I'm going to line these up and getting them as kind of close as possible to each other without the seam allowances overlapping. overlapping. You may choose to rotate things upside down if they fit better. Just remember, if you're going to tape all of these pages together, think about your grain line when you're cutting out, and if your fabric has a nap or if you can cut things upside down, just keep that in mind when you're rotating. The other thing you want to keep in mind is where the breaks in the pages are. You want to avoid breaking a pattern into too many pieces across pages. So I put a guide at 2 pages wide. I know my sleeve won't fit in 1 page width, but I don't want to break it up across 3 pages. This is something you can tweak a bit after exporting in Illustrator, but I find it easiest to plan ahead using CLO, so do the best that you can here. Again, if you rotate patterns off the straight grain, just make sure that you know that and that you're cutting them out correctly. And here I'm going to mark out another page break to make sure that I don't unnecessarily split my collar across pages. If I was clever, I probably should have marked out the page breaks going vertically so that I could plan those better as well. I did a bit more tweaking to improve my yield and then double checked to make sure none of my seam allowances were overlapping. I'm sure if I played with this a bit longer, I could optimize this further. If you want to add any annotations to the pattern, that tool is here. You simply click down and type what you want to write. The edit annotation tool is here, and that allows you to rotate it or move it around the pattern. There are also lots of pattern symbol options. If you press and hold the annotation tool, you can drop down to pattern symbol and select a line, and you'll be able to apply something from this drop down menu. Things for gathering or ease, pattern matching, cut unfold, there's arrows and things for pleats, etc. The other thing you can add in CLO are pattern names by selecting the pattern and typing in the very first section of the property editor. To see names and annotations, turn them on here under the information icon. I prefer to add my names and annotations in Illustrator afterwards. I find that I have more control over the font, the size, and the placement there. Now we're ready to export. To export, go to File, Export, Adobe PDF. Choose the file path, name it, and then click Save. The first thing I'm going to set are my page margins. These need to be at least the width of your seam allowance, so I'm doing mine a little bit bigger at 1/2 inch. Then you can check the boxes for what we want to show in the export. So I always check on my internal lines. I recommend this one so that your notches will show, and of course pattern outlines and seam allowance. Make sure that everything under Show Images is unchecked. And here I'm going to uncheck pattern names and annotations because I'll add those in Illustrator. If you want to check on grain lines, this will put a grain line on every pattern piece, which can be helpful if you've rotated your pattern pieces around to arrange them. I usually like my grain lined up with everything so that I just treat it all as being on the straight grain, but I did flip some pieces around, so it's up to you if you want to print those. And then I do want to check on button and buttonholes for my buttonhole placement. Anything else you want to check on is up to you, and then you can say OK. Currently, there's a lot of cleaning up to do with the export in Illustrator. So you can see that there's a fill color on mine, and that's due to the fact that I have a color applied to my fabric. So even when you uncheck the textures, you still get a fill, and if it looks like you don't have one, then your fill is just white. The first thing you need to do is grab your white arrow and marquee over a corner of the artboard and delete the clipping mask that's applied to the whole thing. Then you can select the middle of the fill color and delete those. You can also go to Select at the top and go to Same Fill Color, and it will select them all, and you can delete them all at once. Using your black arrow, right-click on each pattern and choose Release Clipping Mask if you see the option. Many of them will have clipping masks, and you need to release them. If you don't see the option, then it doesn't have a clipping mask. Now I'm going to zoom in, and with my white arrow, I'm going to select all of my internal lines and baselines so that I can unify the color and stroke. Once they're all selected, I'm going to select my outline color and set that. I'm choosing just a random red, and then I'll select my stroke weight, and my internal lines are going to be 1 point. I can see that I still have some blue lines, which tells me I have multiple lines on top of each other. So I select my red lines and lock them to then select the blue line underneath and hit delete. I'll repeat the process for everything that's blue, and then when you're ready, you can unlock everything. Then, just like my internal lines before, I'm now going to select all of my sew lines to make sure that those are all the same stroke. For some lines, the stroke will be set to 0 and you won't actually see the line, so you need to make sure that you check this. I'm going to set all of mine to 0.5. I'm going to do the same exact thing for all my pattern outlines, except for these, I'm going to set the stroke to 3 to actually darken them up. You'll see the stroke color is actually gray. I didn't, but you may want to change this to black. Now I'm going to grab my artboard tool. I need to extend my artboard at the bottom because my margin didn't account for the bottom hem. And I'm going to give myself a little extra room at the top and to the side. With the text tool, you can add any annotations or pattern labels that you want. Set whatever font and size you want. Use your black arrow to rotate or move the text around. For my downloadable PDFs, I like to use my pen tool to draw a grain line for all of the patterns. But if this is just for you, you probably don't even need a grain line because you probably know what they all are, or else you could have exported them from CLO. Whether you're ready to print or you just want to set the file up for printing, you're still going to go to File, Print. You'll want to set the paper size here. And let's say you're setting this up to save a PDF to print at your local print shop. Maybe you're printing at A0. If you don't see the paper option here because your printer doesn't have that, then just make sure your printer is set to Adobe PDF, and then you won't be limited by print options. Next, you're going to set this drop-down menu to Tile Full Pages. On the left here, you're going to get a preview of how it's going to separate out all your prints into whatever page size you chose. You can click and drag the entire artboard around here, but if you need to move any patterns around to make it more efficient, then you'll need to close this and do that in your regular artboard of Illustrator. So I'm going to move my collar and undercollar up into this negative space so that they're only split over 2 pieces of paper instead of 3. You can see here I can move my entire artboard around if I want to make sure that my sleeve is in the right place so that it doesn't cross over the width of 2 pages. But it's quite tricky because it's so small to really see what you're doing. Truthfully, I could have made this much more efficient with less wasted space, probably printed on fewer pages, and maybe some of these patterns wouldn't be spread over as many pieces of paper, but it's just a matter of how much time you want to spend setting it up. So if you're ready to print, then make sure this drop-down menu is set to your home printer. And if you just want to save it out, you can leave it set to Adobe PDF and then say print either way. If you have it set to Adobe PDF, then you'll just be asked to name the file path and name it and click save. So here's what each of my pages are going to look like printed out at letter size. So what I will do is just butt the pages up to each other and tape them together. In the printer settings, you may have noticed this little menu for overlap, which allows you to actually extend the artwork, or in this case the pattern, by a specific amount, so that you can actually overlap the pieces when you tape them together. The purpose of this is to account for the fact that most home printers don't print full bleed all the way to the edge of the paper. But for me, with patterns that need to be super accurate, I find that it would be way too much work in taping them together to make sure that you overlapped them by the exact amount. So for me, I think it's better to butt the pages up. That's quick and easy to tape together. The gap left by the printer at the edges is usually pretty narrow, and then you know that you're not altering the size of the pattern.